The steam was a ghost in the room, clinging to the rough-hewn walls and beating on the single pane of glass that looked out onto the dusty main street of Jericho Springs. It carried the clean, sharp scent of lye soap and hot water, a smell of civilization in a place that was often anything but. Inside that humid halo, her hands moved with a practiced economy that was its own language. Fold, press, stack. The cotton sheets, bleached bone white by sun and effort, became perfect, crisp rectangles under her small, sure fingers. She worked without pause, her whole world narrowed to the rhythm of the work, the smooth glide of fabric, the heat from the big copper tub. Her name was Mei Lien, and she was a widow. Her husband's body had been sent back from the railroad line in a plain pine box, his name one of a dozen lost to a premature dynamite blast. And now all that was left of him was the small laundry he had built for her and the silence that filled it. The world outside the steamy window was a different kind of silence, a hostile one. It was the silence of men who stared too long, of women who crossed the street to avoid her, of a town that saw her not as a person, but as a strange, foreign problem that had washed up on its shores. She had learned to live inside their silence, to build a fortress of routine and labor. Fold, press, stack. It was a prayer. It was a shield. The sound, when it came, was a violent punctuation to the quiet hum of her work. Not the dull thud of a horse's hoof or the rumble of a wagon, but a sharp, crystalline crack that seemed to shatter the very air. A rock, the size of a man's fist, lay on the floor amid a spiderweb of shattered glass. Cold air rushed in, carrying the dust and the derisive laughter of boys who were almost men. She did not jump. She did not cry out. She simply stopped, her hands resting on a half-folded shirt. She took one slow, deep breath, the cold, dusty air a shock in her lungs after the warm steam. Then she let it out. She walked to the corner, took up a small broom and dustpan, and began to sweep up the shards. Each piece of glass she collected was a testament to their cruelty, and each sweep of the broom was a refusal to be broken by it. From across the street, in the deep shadow of the livery stable, Sheriff Silas Blackwood watched. He saw the rock thrown, heard the laughter, and then he saw her quiet, methodical response. He had been sheriff of Jericho Springs for 10 years, a tenure built on a kind of monumental stillness. He was not a man for quick draws or grand speeches. He was a man who watched, who waited, who understood that true power in a town like this was not in the badge on his chest but in the weight of his presence. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and weathered, with hands that were calloused from work, not violence, and a gaze that missed nothing. He had seen the small cruelties pile up against the Chinese widow for months. The whispers, the spat tobacco near her doorway, the children who ran past chanting cruelties learned from their parents. He had warned Jebediah Cain's boys to leave her be, but warnings to boys like that were like throwing pebbles against a mountain. They just bounced off. This, however, was different. A shattered window was not a whisper. It was a declaration. He watched her sweep the glass, her movements deliberate and contained, and he felt a slow, cold anger begin to burn in his gut. The law was a flimsy thing out here. It could hang a horse thief or settle a claim dispute, but it was nearly useless against the slow, grinding pressure of a town's contempt. He knew what would happen. The window would be the start. Soon it would be worse. He pushed himself off the wall of the livery, the dust swirling around his boots. The townspeople who had gathered to watch the small drama melted away at his approach, not wanting to be involved. They were a passive chorus, their silence a form of consent. Silas did not look at them. His eyes were on the small woman in the laundry, alone in her broken world. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like the winter cold, that he was going to have to do something. The law was not enough, not for this. Afternoon. Silas Blackwood's life was a map of routines. He walked the same patrol at the same time every day, his path worn into the town's dusty consciousness. He checked the locks on the mercantile, had a brief, clipped conversation with the blacksmith about a new set of shoes for his horse, and drank a cup of scalding coffee at the hotel that was more chicory than bean. His house was at the far edge of town, a small solid structure he had built himself, as plain and unadorned as the man who lived in it. It was a house for one, and had been for all the years he'd been in Jericho Springs. He was a solitary man by nature and by necessity. A sheriff couldn't afford too many friends, because friends could become liabilities. He ate his meals alone, simple affairs of beans and bacon or a tough cut of steak he cooked over his own fire. And in the evenings, he would sit on his porch and carve, his big hands surprisingly deft as he turned scraps of wood into small, smooth shapes of birds and animals. It was a way to quiet his mind, to sand down the rough edges of the day. The town of Jericho Springs was his responsibility, a fractious, noisy, and often cruel child he was charged with raising. He saw the good in it, the homesteaders trying to scratch a life from the unforgiving soil, the decent families who kept to themselves. But he also saw the rot. He saw it in men like Jebediah Cain, a rancher whose land and cattle were exceeded only by his arrogance. Cain believed ownership of the land gave him ownership of the people on it, and his sons and ranch hands moved through the town with a casual swagger that was just shy of a threat. They were the ones who had been tormenting Mei Lien. Silas knew it as surely as he knew the sun would rise. Cain wanted the plot of land her laundry sat on, a prime spot on the main street, and he was using his boys to apply the kind of pressure the law couldn't touch. Silas had lived with the low hum of this injustice for weeks, a dissonant note in the town's daily life. He had told himself it was not his place to interfere beyond a warning, that Mei Lien was a citizen like any other, and the law was her protection. But watching her sweep that glass, he knew it was a lie. She was not a citizen like any other. She was an outsider, a woman, and a foreigner, a trifecta of vulnerabilities in a town that preyed on weakness. Her husband was dead. She had no family, no one to stand for her. If Cain's boys pushed harder, no one would stop them. The thought sat like a stone in his stomach as he finished his coffee. He was a man of the law, but the law was a set of rules. And what was happening to Mei Lien was outside those rules. It was a matter of a different kind of justice, a moral calculus that had nothing to do with statutes and courtrooms. He walked back to his office, the tin star on his chest feeling heavier than usual. He sat behind his desk, the wood worn smooth by his predecessors, and stared at the wall. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or complicated schemes. His thinking was direct, linear, like a fence line running straight to the horizon. The problem was protection. Mei Lien needed a shield that Cain and his kind would respect, something more durable than a sheriff's warning. He thought about running Cain's boys out of town, but they'd just come back. He thought about arresting them, but he knew Cain would have them out on bail within an hour, and no jury in this county would convict them for harassing the Chinese widow. The answer, when it came to him, was so simple and so radical that he sat perfectly still for a long time, just letting the weight of it settle. It was not a solution born of law books or procedure. It was a frontier solution, born of pragmatism and a stark understanding of the world he lived in. It was a shield of a different kind, a name, a roof, a presence. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floorboards. The decision was made. It was a crazy thing. It was a necessary thing. He put on his hat, his face set in grim lines. He would not spend a long time afterward wondering if it was the right choice. He only knew it was the only choice he had. That night, the air in the laundry was thick with more than steam. It was thick with menace. 3 of Cain's ranch hands were there, their bodies filling the small space, their spurs scarring the damp wooden floor. They were not customers. They had pushed their way in just after dusk, their laughter loud and raw. One of them, a lanky youth named Billy, held up a freshly laundered shirt, sniffing it with exaggerated disgust. "Smells funny," he drawled, looking at his friends for approval. "Smells like everything she touches." Mei Lien stood by the cold copper tub, her hands clasped before her, her back ramrod straight. She did not look at them. She looked at a point on the wall just over their heads, her face a mask of calm. But inside, her heart was a trapped bird, beating frantically against her ribs. She had known this was coming. The broken window was a promise, and this was its fulfillment. They wanted her to scream. They wanted her to cry. They wanted her to run. She would do none of those things. The second man, burly and bearded, picked up a stack of folded towels and tossed them onto the damp floor, one by one. "Oops," he said, his voice a low chuckle. "Clumsy me." The third man just leaned against the doorframe, blocking the only exit, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He was enjoying the show. The town was silent around them. Through the broken window, May could see the lights of the saloon, could hear the faint sound of a poorly played piano. Help was only 50 yards away, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles. No one was coming. They were a spectacle. Her fear and her humiliation were their evening's entertainment. "Maybe she don't understand English so good," Billy said, stepping closer to her. He dropped the shirt and reached out, his dirty fingers brushing against the sleeve of her tunic. "Maybe we need to teach her." It was the touch that broke her composure. Not the insults, not the ruined laundry, but the violation of her space, the claim his touch made on her. A small, involuntary flinch went through her body. She took a half step back, her foot bumping against a wooden bucket. The man's smile widened. He had found the crack in her armor. He was about to speak again when a shadow fell across the doorway. The man leaning against the frame suddenly stood up straight, the smile gone from his face. "Sheriff," he mumbled, pulling his hat lower. Silas Blackwood filled the doorway. He did not seem to be breathing hard, did not seem to be in a hurry, yet his presence sucked all the air out of the room. He looked past the three men, his eyes landing on Mei Lien, taking in her rigid posture, the scattered towels on the floor, the way Billy snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. Silas's gaze was flat, devoid of emotion. He looked at the towels on the floor. He looked at the fear that had replaced the arrogance in the men's eyes. Then he looked at Billy. "I believe I told you to leave her be," he said. His voice was quiet. It was not a shout. It was something worse. It was the sound of a rock slide starting far up a mountain, a low rumble that promised devastation. "We was just funnin', Sheriff," Billy stammered, his bravado evaporating like morning mist. "Weren't no harm meant." Silas took one step into the room. It was not a large step, but it made the three men shrink back. "Pick them up," he said, nodding toward the towels. The bearded man hesitated for a second, then seemed to think better of it. He bent down, his face red with anger and humiliation, and started gathering the soiled laundry. Silas did not take his eyes off them. He watched them pick up every last towel, watched them stack them, clumsily on the edge of the washing tub. "Now get out," he said, his voice still quiet, still deadly. "And if I see you within 20 feet of this establishment again, funnin' or not, I will personally escort you to a cell to think about your life choices." They practically fell over each other in their haste to leave, stumbling out into the night. Gone. Silence descended on the small room, heavier and more profound than before. It was just the two of them now, the tall, unmovable sheriff and the small, unshakable widow. The air crackled with the unsaid. Dust motes danced in the single beam of lamplight from the street, illuminating the wreckage of the evening. The broken window, the damp floor, the faint, sour smell of fear. Silas looked at the mess. He looked at her. Her face was still a mask, but he could see the faint tremor in her hands, the slight tremble in her lower lip that she was fighting to control. He saw the cost of her defiance. He saw the price of her solitude. He knew in that moment that his warnings, his occasional interventions, they were just patches on a wound that was festering. The infection was the town itself, and men like Cain were its fever. Driving off three boys was not a solution. It was a postponement. They would be back, or others would come. The only way to stop it was to change the entire equation. He turned his gaze from the room to her, and for the first time, he really looked at her, not as a problem to be solved or a victim to be protected, but as a person. He saw the intelligence in her dark, almond-shaped eyes, the proud set of her jaw, the spine of steel that held her upright when everything around her was trying to knock her down. He had come here to run off the boys. He had done that. His duty was done. He could turn around, walk out, and go back to his solitary house. But he didn't move. He was held there by the weight of what he knew he had to do, the sheer, insane logic of it. He took a step closer, into the circle of her steam-scented world. He was so large he seemed to block out the light from the doorway. She did not flinch, but her eyes, which had been fixed on the far wall, dropped to meet his. He could see the exhaustion in them, the bone-deep weariness of a constant, lonely battle. He saw a woman who had been strong for too long. His own voice, when it came, sounded strange in the quiet room, rough and unused to this kind of talk. He cleared his throat. He looked not at her face but at her hands, those small, capable hands that had swept up the broken glass. He spoke to them. "This won't stop," he said. It was a statement of fact, brutal and unadorned. "They'll keep coming." She said nothing. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. He had to force the next words out. They felt like stones in his mouth. He was a man of action, of simple truths. This was complex. This was unheard of. But it was the only thing, the only shield that would hold. He finally raised his eyes from her hands to her face. He held her gaze. The whole world seemed to stop, waiting. "Marry me," Silas Blackwood said. The words hung in the air between them, stark and unbelievable. It was not a question. It was a proposal of a different sort entirely. A contract, a fortress, a wall of his own name and reputation, built around her. It was the only thing he had to offer that was strong enough. The silence that followed his words was absolute. Mei Lien stared at him, her dark eyes wide, searching his face for any sign of mockery or madness. She found neither. She saw only a grim, resolute certainty. Marry him. The idea was a meteor crashing into the placid, predictable ocean of her misery. It was so outside the realm of possibility that for a moment she thought she had misunderstood him, a trick of the foreign tongue. But the look on his face was unmistakable. He was utterly serious. Her mind raced, sifting through the implications. This was not a proposal of love or affection. She knew that. She was not a fool. This was a business transaction, as cold and practical as the purchase of a deed or a horse. He was offering her the one thing no one else could, the protection of his name. As the sheriff's wife, she would cease to be a target of sport. She would become part of his territory, and no one in Jericho Springs was foolish enough to trespass on Silas Blackwood's territory. The price was her life, her independence, such as it was. She would be trading one cage for another, perhaps. The cage of a lonely, despised widow for the cage of a strange, pitied wife. But this new cage had a guard. She looked around her small, broken laundry. The scattered towels, the shattered window, the lingering smell of stale sweat and cheap whiskey from Cain's men. This was her independence. This was her freedom. A life of waiting for the next rock, the next insult, the next violation. He was offering her a way out. Not a promise of happiness, but a promise of peace, a promise of being left alone. She thought of her late husband, of the quiet dignity he had always carried. He would have wanted her to survive. Survival was the only creed that mattered. She gave a single, sharp nod. One nod. It was enough. The next morning they stood before the justice of the peace, a portly man named Abernathy who smelled of pipe tobacco and disbelief. The ceremony was brief, the words spoken in a monotone. Silas stood stiff and uncomfortable in his good coat. May wore her only clean dark tunic. There were no flowers, no well wishes, only the scratching of a pen on a legal document and the bewildered stare of the justice's clerk who served as a witness. When Abernathy said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," there was an awkward pause. Silas did not kiss her. He simply offered her his arm, a formal, distant gesture. She took it, her small hand barely resting on his sleeve. They walked out of the courthouse and into the full glare of the morning sun. The town already knew. News like this traveled faster than a telegraph. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their conversations to stare. Women gathered in small, whispering clutches. Silas ignored them all, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his jaw set. He led her not to the laundry, but to his house at the edge of town. He had already brought the wagon. Without a word, they went to her small room behind the laundry and gathered her meager belongings. A wooden chest containing her clothes, her husband's few books, a small porcelain tea set, and the tools of her trade, the irons, the scrubbing board. It all fit in the back of the wagon with room to spare. He drove them to his house, the one he had built with his own hands. It was as she had imagined it, clean, sparse, and masculine. He led her to a small spare room at the back. "This will be he said. He placed her chest at the foot of the narrow bed. And that was it. He was the sheriff. She was the Chinese widow. Now they were husband and wife, a legal fact, a town scandal, and two strangers standing in a quiet house with a world of silence between them. The days that followed the strange, silent wedding settled into a new and awkward rhythm. They were two planets orbiting a single sun, held together by a force they did not understand, living in the same house but in different worlds. Silas rose before the dawn, as he always had, drank his coffee black and bitter, and was gone before she had even lit the stove. He was the sheriff, and the town's demands were his constant companion. Mei, left in the quiet solitude of his house, did the only thing she knew how to do. She worked. She took the small room he had given her and a lean-to shed out back and transformed them into a new, smaller version of her laundry. She told him she would pay for her keep, her voice soft but firm, and he had simply nodded, not arguing. Soon the scent of lye soap and clean steam was mingling with the scent of pine and leather in his house. The town's women who had once been her customers were hesitant at first, torn between their need for clean linens and their disapproval of the sheriff's scandalous marriage. But Silas's name was a powerful currency. A quiet word from him at the mercantile, a long, steady look at a gossiping husband in the saloon, and slowly, cautiously, the bundles of laundry began to appear on the back porch. They shared their evenings in an almost complete silence. He would come home as the sun set, his face etched with the weariness of the day. He would wash his face and hands in the basin on the porch, the splashing of water the only announcement of his arrival. She would have a meal ready, placed on the simple wooden table. At first she cooked what she thought he would want, the same bland fare of beans and salted meat that he was used to. He ate it without comment, his eyes on his plate. They were like two actors in a play for which neither had been given a script, improvising their way through the scenes of a shared life. He would sit at one end of the table, she at the other, the space between them a vast, uncharted territory. After eating, he would retreat to the porch to carve his wood, the scrape of his knife a soft, rhythmic sound in the twilight. She would clean the kitchen, her movements as quiet and efficient as a moth's. She never intruded on his solitude on the porch. He never intruded on her quiet work in the kitchen. Yet they were intensely aware of each other. He began to notice things. He noticed the way she mended a tear in one of his shirts before he had even seen it was torn, the stitches so fine they were almost invisible. He noticed a small pot of herbs growing on the windowsill, something green and alive in the starkness of his home. One day he came home to find the scent of ginger and star anise in the air, and a bowl of steaming noodles and broth on the table instead of the usual beans. He ate it, the unfamiliar flavors a quiet explosion in his mouth. It was delicious. He looked at her across the table, intending to say so, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply ate a second bowl. It was his only compliment, but she understood it. She, in turn, began to see the man behind the badge. She saw the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was looking. She saw the network of fine lines around his eyes, lines of worry and responsibility. One evening, he came home with a deep gash on his forearm from breaking up a brawl. He said nothing of it, but she saw him struggle to wash it at the basin. After their silent dinner, while he sat on the porch, she brought out a bowl of warm water and clean bandages. She did not ask for permission. She simply knelt before him, took his arm, and began to clean the wound with a practiced gentleness. He sat perfectly still, his knife forgotten in his lap, watching her dark hair fall across her face as she worked. Her touch was light, professional, and yet it was the most profound contact they had ever had. When she was done, she tied the bandage and stood to leave. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rasp. She paused at the doorway, and for the first time, a small smile touched her lips. She did not turn around. "You are welcome, Sheriff," she said softly, and then she was gone, leaving him alone in the gathering dark with the clean scent of herbs and the strange, warm feeling of her touch on his skin. The seasons began to turn, the fierce summer heat giving way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The silence in Silas Blackwood's house began to change. It was no longer an empty, awkward void between two strangers, but a comfortable, shared quiet, like the space between two trees that have grown up side by side. It was a silence filled with the small, unspoken rituals of their life together. It was in the way he started leaving his hat on the peg inside the door, a small signal that he was home for the night, that the outside world had been shut out. It was in the way she started waiting for him to be seated before she brought the food to the table, a small gesture of respect that had become a habit. The people of Jericho Springs watched, and their whispers slowly changed from scandalized to merely curious. The sheriff's strange marriage had become part of the town's landscape, a peculiar landmark that was now simply there. They saw Silas stand a little straighter. They saw a peace in him that had not been there before. And they saw Mei Lien. They saw her walk through town, no longer with her eyes downcast, but with a quiet confidence. She was still the Chinese widow, but now she was also Mrs. Blackwood, and the name was a cloak of safety she wore with dignity. One afternoon at the mercantile, Silas was buying flour and coffee when he overheard two women talking. "It's a shame is what it is," one of them, Mrs. Gable, said, not bothering to lower her voice. "A man like the sheriff, saddled with her, she's got him bewitched." Silas stopped what he was doing. He turned slowly, his face calm, but his eyes were like chips of ice. The store went quiet. He walked over to the two women. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice low and even, "the woman you are speaking of is my wife, and I have found her to be a woman of great character and strength. I would appreciate it if you would remember that." He tipped his hat. "Good day, ladies." He paid for his goods and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. That evening, he came home to find a small, intricately carved wooden bird sitting on his pillow. It was one of his own carvings, one he had thought lost. She had found it, cleaned the dust from its wings, and placed it where he would find it. It was her way of saying she had heard. It was her way of saying thank you. Their conversations remained clipped, functional, but they were now threaded with a new kind of intimacy. One night, as she was banking the fire, he spoke from his chair where he was reading the week-old newspaper. "The laundry," he said, "the one in town. Kane is trying to sell the lot." She stopped, her back to him. "He will get a good price," she said softly. "It is a good location." "It was your location," he said. He folded the paper and placed it on the table. "He took it from you." She turned to face him, her expression calm. "He did not take it," she said. "My husband built it. I ran it. It was a place. What I have, I carry with me." She gestured vaguely, a small, graceful motion that took in the small, warm room, the scent of baking bread, the quiet peace of the house. He understood. She was not defined by a building, by a plot of land. Her worth, her home, was something internal, something she had built inside herself. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not the victim he had rescued, but the partner who had, in many ways, rescued him from his own sterile solitude. He was the sheriff, a man of law and order, but she was teaching him about a different kind of strength, a resilience that bent but did not break, a quiet power that had nothing to do with a badge or a gun. He had married her to protect her. He was beginning to realize she was the one protecting him. The news of Silas's public defense of his wife at the mercantile spread through Jericho Springs like a prairie fire. It solidified the new reality. Mei Lien was not some temporary ward or a charity case. She was the sheriff's wife, and he would brook no disrespect toward her. For most of the town, this was the final word on the matter. They accepted it, moved on. But for Jebediah Kane, it was a gallon of fuel poured on a smoldering fire of resentment. Kane was a man who understood the world in terms of ownership and dominance. He had wanted Mei Lien's land and had seen her as a mere obstacle, a piece to be swept off the board. Silas's intervention, and now this marriage, was a direct challenge to his authority, a public humiliation. He had lost the land, but now it was personal. He could no longer attack Mei physically or with his usual brand of thuggish intimidation. She was now wrapped in the protection of the law incarnate. So he shifted his tactics. If he couldn't break her, he would try to poison her. He began a campaign of subtle, vicious slander. His ranch hands, now barred from coming near her, spread rumors in the saloon. They whispered that the food she cooked for the sheriff was tainted with strange herbs to control his mind. They suggested that the laundry she washed for the town was unclean, that she carried diseases from her homeland. It was a coward's attack, insidious and difficult to fight. Some of her laundry customers, weak-willed and susceptible to suggestion, began to drift away. The pile of bundles on the back porch grew smaller. Mei said nothing of it to Silas, but he noticed. He saw the worry she tried to hide, the way her hands were idle for the first time since she had come to his house. The peace they had built was being threatened, not by a thrown rock, but by the slow drip of poison. One evening, Silas walked into the saloon. It was not his usual time. The place fell quiet as he entered. He saw a group of Kane's men holding court at a corner table, their voices loud, their laughter laced with malice. Silas walked directly to the bar and ordered a whiskey. He didn't drink it. He just held the glass, his back to the room, listening. He heard Billy, the same youth from the laundry, telling a story about a friend who got sick after eating some Chinese cooking. Silas turned, his face a mask of cold fury. He walked to their table. "Billy," he said, his voice dangerously soft. The youth looked up, his face paling. "The next time you tell a lie about my wife," Silas said, leaning in close, his voice a whisper that was louder than a shout, "make sure it's a good one, because it will be the last story you tell in this town." He straightened up and looked at the other men. "That goes for all of you." He then turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. He looked back, his eyes sweeping over the silent room. "And one more thing," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "Jebediah Kane does not run this town. I do." He left. The saloon remained silent for a long time after he was gone. Later that week, Silas rode out to the Kane ranch. He found Jebediah Kane overseeing the branding of new calves, the air thick with the smell of smoke and singed hair. Kane saw him coming, a smug look on his face. "Sheriff," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "You know why I'm here, Kane," Silas said, not dismounting, his position on the horse giving him a natural authority. "Your boys, your rumors." Kane laughed, a short, ugly sound. "My boys have free speech, same as anyone. Can't help what folks are saying. Maybe if you hadn't married." "Stop," Silas said. The word cut through the air like a whip. "This is not a discussion. This is a notification. You will stop. The rumors, the whispers, the lies. All of it. You will tell your boys to find a new hobby. This ends today." Kane's face hardened, the pretense of civility gone. "Or what, Blackwood? You'll arrest me? For what? Hurt feelings?" Silas leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes locking with Kane's. "No, Jedediah," he said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling tone. "I won't arrest you, but you and I both know there's a line. You've been dancing on it for a month. You cross it, and you'll find out what happens next. This is not about the law. This is about my home, and I defend my home." He straightened up, pulled on the reins of his horse, and turned to leave without another word, leaving Kane standing in the dust, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage. The message had been delivered. The war was declared. The first snow of winter had just dusted the peaks of the distant mountains when Kane made his final, desperate move. He was a man cornered, his public influence checked, and his private vendetta thwarted. A man like Kane, when stripped of his power to intimidate, had only one tool left: blunt, stupid violence. He chose a night when a storm was rolling in, the wind howling down from the mountains, rattling the windows and covering the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Silas was late. A dispute over a poker game at the saloon had turned ugly, and he had been forced to lock up two drunken prospectors to cool off. Mei was alone in the house, finishing the last of the mending by the warm glow of the fire. The laundry business had returned, stronger than before, after Silas's stand in the saloon. The town had chosen its side. She felt a sense of peace, of belonging, that she had not felt since she had left her homeland. A sudden, violent crash from the back of the house shattered the quiet. It was the sound of the lean-to door being kicked in. She froze, the needle falling from her fingers. Her first thought was of Silas. Her second was a cold, familiar dread. They had come back, but this time was different. This was not her laundry. This was not her small room. This was her home. She was not the lonely widow anymore. She was Mrs. Blackwood, and she would defend her home. She didn't scream. She didn't hide. She moved. Her mind, trained in the quiet efficiency of her work, assessed the situation with terrifying clarity. She heard heavy, drunken voices from the back. Two of them. Cain's men, no doubt, sent to do the dirty work their master was too cowardly to do himself. She ran not away from the sound, but toward the kitchen. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for a weapon. The carving knives were there, but they were too close. She needed distance. Her eyes fell on the big pot of stew simmering on the stove for Silas's dinner. It was heavy. It was boiling hot. It was perfect. She grabbed two thick cloths, her hands steady, and lifted the pot. As the two men stumbled into the main room, their faces lit by the firelight, she was waiting. It was Billy and the bearded one. "Where is he?" the bearded one slurred, brandishing a heavy wooden club. "Don't matter," Billy said, his eyes wild. "We'll wait." He saw Mei then, standing by the stove, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Look what we have here, the sheriff's little pet." He took a step toward her. He never took a second. With a cry that was not of fear but of pure, focused rage, Mei swung the heavy pot of boiling stew. The scalding liquid arced through the air, a wave of liquid fire. It caught Billy full in the face and chest. He screamed, a high, terrible sound, as he clawed at his blistering skin, staggering backward into a table. The bearded man, stunned for a second, roared and lunged for her, but she was already moving. She dropped the now empty pot and dove for the fireplace, grabbing the heavy iron poker. It was heavy and solid in her hands. She held it like a sword. At that exact moment, the front door burst open. Silas stood there, his gun drawn, his face a storm of fury. He had heard the scream as he was walking from the stable. He took in the scene in a split second. The screaming man on the floor, the other one advancing on Mei and his wife, his quiet, gentle wife, standing like a warrior, ready to fight to the death with a fireplace poker. "Drop it!" Silas roared. The bearded man froze, caught between the gun and the poker. He dropped the club as if it were on fire. The fight was over. Silas moved quickly, disarming and subduing the conscious man, his movements economical and brutal. He tied him securely, then checked on Billy, who was moaning in agony on the floor. His face was a mess of burns. He would live, but he would carry the memory of this night for the rest of his life. After the men were secured, Silas finally turned to Mei. She was still standing by the fire, the poker held tightly in her hands. Her whole body was trembling, the reaction setting in. He walked over to her, his boots loud on the floorboards. He gently took the poker from her hands and let it fall to the floor. Then he did something he had never done before. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart, or maybe it was his own. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, of smoke, of home. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'm here. You're safe." She didn't cry. She just leaned into him, her small frame held up by his strength, and for the first time she let herself be weak, knowing he was strong enough for them both. Weeks later, the snow lay thick and quiet over Jericho Springs, muffling the world in a blanket of white. The incident at the sheriff's house had become the stuff of town legend. Jebediah Cain, implicated by his men, had sold his ranch for a fraction of its worth and disappeared overnight, his reign of casual cruelty finally at an end. Billy and his companion, after a brief stay in Silas's jail, were put on a stagecoach heading east with a permanent ban on ever returning. Peace had been restored. But it was a new kind of peace. In the small house at the edge of town, the quiet was different now. It was a deep, resonant peace, born not of absence but of presence. The wall of silence between Silas and Mei had not just been cracked, it had been demolished, washed away by a tide of boiling stew and shared danger. They sat together on the covered porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the snow fall. He was cleaning his gun, his large hands moving with their usual methodical grace. She was mending a blanket, her needle flashing in the gray afternoon light. They didn't need to speak. They had learned a new language, one spoken in shared glances, in the comfortable proximity of their chairs, in the simple act of being together. He finished his work, wiping the last of the oil from the barrel of his revolver. He laid it aside and watched her for a moment. He watched the way the light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, the focused intensity in her eyes as she worked. He thought about the man he had been before she came into his life, a man living in a house but not a home, a man surrounded by people, but utterly alone. He had thought he was rescuing her, but he saw now that she had been the one to rescue him. She had brought color to his monochrome world, warmth to his cold, empty house, and a purpose to his life that went far beyond the tin star he wore. She finished her stitch and looked up, as if sensing his gaze. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes and made them shine. In that moment, he knew. The marriage had started as a contract, a shield, a pragmatic arrangement to ensure her safety. It had become something else entirely. It had become his life. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering her small one, which still held the needle. Her fingers were warm. He did not say, "I love you." The words were too small, too simple for the vast, complex thing that had grown between them. He did not need to. She knew. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. They sat there for a long time as the snow continued to fall, their hands clasped together, two solitary figures who had found in each other a harbor against the storm. The sheriff had married the widow to protect her, and somewhere along the way, in the quiet spaces between silent meals and shared dangers, he had fallen in love with her. And he had, in turn, been saved. Thank you for spending this time with us. It is in the quiet moments, in the choices made when no one is looking, that true character is often revealed. We build our lives one small, deliberate act at a time, and sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to offer a hand to someone in the dark, not knowing if they will take it. We hope this story reminds you of the power of quiet strength and the unexpected places where we can find our home. If you've ever been surprised by the resilience of the human heart, let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed our story, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us to continue bringing these tales to you. Until next time, be kind, be brave, and look for the strength in the silence.